Welcome back. I'm glad to have another opportunity to share with you thoughts in an introduction to Islam. I appreciate the messages that were posted to the bulletin board from a number of you, giving me the opportunity to begin to get acquainted with you. Our focus today is on the topic of the origins of Islam. And in conjunction with the origins of Islam, we want to look at Muhammad, something of the life and the significance of Muhammad for the Muslim. But first of all, we want to start with Arabia. We want to start with geography. You have a link that you can go to that will take you to maps of Arabia, where you can look at a variety of maps that will show you something of the topography of that great landmass, and also show you something of the peoples who lived there in Muhammad's day and some of the political forces that were influencing that part of the world. And all of that gave shape to some of what we're talking about. Arabia is a huge area of land. As you spend some time with the map, you will notice that in Muhammad's day, much of the inhabited part of Arabia was basically on the west side, along the Red Sea. Far to the south in Arabia was the country of Yemen. Yemen served as a rich source of spices and other commodities, and also was the point at which ships coming from the Indian subcontinent landed. And their treasures then were transferred to camel caravan and hence carried north through Arabia, ultimately to places like Jerusalem and Damascus, and to the west into Egypt. Along that trade route were a couple of important cities. For our purposes, the two most important cities were the cities of Mecca and Medina. Maybe a way to think about Mecca is to think of it as a gigantic truck stop at the point where two major interstates come together. Now, if you're living in the United States, you can think of such a place. Those great interstate highways come together, and in close proximity to that point, someone has established a business to service all of the motorized caravans that are going up and down the highway. Mecca more or less served that kind of a role in Muhammad's day. It was a commercial center, a stop on the long road from Yemen in the south to Damascus and Jerusalem in the north. When we think of Arabia, we often tend to think of just huge sand dunes, sand everywhere, and that's probably the result, again, of the media, Hollywood, books, pictures we've seen. And while there are parts of the Arabian Peninsula that are that way, there are also areas where there are oases with date palms that grow. There are places where grain is raised, and in the mountains of Yemen, all sorts of other crops are produced. We have to recognize that no one being born into this world is born into a vacuum. When you were born, the world was already here, certain conditions already existed. The state of this land, of education, of economics, of religion was already in place, and you were simply plunked down in the middle of that. Well, when we think about Islam and when we think about the coming of Muhammad, the same thing is true. Arabia was not a vacuum. It was a place where a variety of different influences were at work. And I want to enumerate some of those for you. The first has to do simply with political forces. Toward the north of the Arabian Peninsula, there were two gigantic nations in a struggle for control of the world. A decade or so ago, we would have likened it to the ongoing conflict between the United States or the West and the Soviet Union or the communist world. Two giants struggling with each other to see who was going to dominate. In the case of Muhammad's day in Arabia, the force in the West was called the Byzantine Empire and was nominally Christian, with its capital at Constantinople, the place that today is called Istanbul, Turkey. The part in the east was the Persian Empire, sometimes known as the Sassanid Empire. These two great political entities were struggling with each other for control of that whole part of the world. An illustration that always comes to my mind, you may have seen pictures of sumo wrestlers. These gigantic individuals who are huffing and puffing and struggling to bump one another and throw one another down. Well, that's kind of what was going on in Muhammad's day between Byzantium and the Sassanid Empire of Persia. And each of these great players was basically worn out. Each had in turn enlisted certain Arabs in the north of Arabia to be their allies, as sort of buffer states between them. Off to the south of the Arabian Peninsula was Yemen. Yemen had a large Christian population, and on occasion the king of Ethiopia had come over, exercised some influence over Yemen, and had attempted to influence the Arabian Peninsula in behalf of the Christians of Byzantium. So what I'm saying to you is there were political currents swirling around that part of the world, creating a degree of instability. A second thing that was going on had to do with the socioeconomic dimension of life. Many of the people in the Arabian Peninsula were Bedouins, tribal people, who lived a nomadic life, moving from here to there. And yet, in view of the trade that took place along the trade route, the interstate, if you will, from Yemen to Damascus, there was a growing degree of urbanization. Communities like Mecca had come into being and had become commercial centers. That had an impact. Those people who were living in the city found themselves more and more caught up in commerce and less interested in people. Among the Bedouins, there had been certain kinds of traditional values that basically said family and clan came first. People were more important than things. Well, we know in urban areas and in times of huge commercial development, those sorts of values begin to erode. That was going on in Arabia. And the impact especially was felt by those who could be described as powerless. Widows, orphans, others reduced to a state of acute poverty in the urban areas. Now, interestingly enough, Muhammad basically grew up as an orphan. So there are socioeconomic factors influencing Arabia at this particular time. Incidentally, the period of time we're talking about is the 7th century after Christ. In other words, the 600s. This is primarily when Muhammad lived his adult life. A third influence that was strong in Arabia at the time involved religious factors. Now, the people of Arabia typically were tribal people worshiping their own local deities, gods and goddesses. So you had a people who primarily were polytheistic. But there were other religious influences in the Arabian Peninsula. From the Persian side, there was the influence of Zoroastrianism. an ancient religion that hardly exists at all today in the world, maybe a few places in Iran and India. But in those days, the state religion of Iran, a religion that believed there were forces of good and evil that were of equal strength, constantly vying with one another for control of the universe. Also in the Arabian Peninsula, there was a sizable Jewish community. In fact, at one time, the Jews had seized control of Yemen and had established a Jewish monarchy. It did not last for long, but nonetheless, they were there. Likewise, they were scattered through the rest of the Arabian Peninsula. Some of these Jews were Jews biologically or genealogically who had come south to get away from the many invasions and problems that had affected Palestine. Others were Arabs who had converted to Judaism. So you had a Jewish influence in the Arabian Peninsula. Now the Jews of Arabia evidently did not have a great deal of access to their own scriptures. And certainly any scriptures that they had access to would have been in Hebrew. So if you encountered Jews who were converted Arabs, or Jews who had been assimilated into Arab society and hence spoke Arabic, those people would have been cut off from any access to their Old Testament scriptures as far as having them in a form that they could read. Nonetheless, they were present in the peninsula and brought with them ideas like one God, prophets, holy books, angels, and related things. There was a bit of a Christian influence in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, Christianity in the eastern part of the world in Muhammad's day was in a confused state of disarray. There were multitudes of vying denominations. Great controversies had taken place concerning the nature of Christ. Is he human? Is he divine? How do those two come together? Other controversies had swirled around Mary. Only in recent years had the discussion been resolved. Is Mary the mother of Jesus or the mother of God? And of course, history shows us that the mother of God people won out. So in the north of Arabia, there were certain Christian cults that basically focused their attention not on God, not on Jesus, not on the Holy Spirit, but on the worship of Mary as the mother of God. The Christianity that Muhammad might have encountered would have been a Christianity caught up in these disputes and discussions, a Christianity that valued celibacy and monks and monasteries. You see, Muhammad did not come into a context that was a vacuum. There was one other religious element, a group that we know little about, a group called the Hanifs, H-A-N-I-F-S, Hanifs. The Hanifs were neither Jews nor Christians nor Zoroastrians, but they were monotheists. They were people who said, we believe in only one God, and the God we believe in is the God of Abraham. There were people of this particular persuasion among some of the Arabs, evidently as a counterculture, a reaction against the polytheism that so characterized that part of the world. So here then is the picture of Arabia into which Muhammad came. You can go to a link that will give you a summation of the main points that I have just set out for you. Along with that, there is an assignment for you to take care of and to post back to me at some time over the course of the next several days. And that assignment has to do with your reflection as to which of these different influences in the Arabian Peninsula might have had the greatest influence on the birth and the shape of Islam. And whichever one or two you pick, then why that one or those two as opposed to some of the others that I have enumerated for you. Now we want to focus in a very specific way on the person of Muhammad. To do this, we need to look at something of Muhammad's life. And that means that we need to have some sense of the major dates that characterize the unfolding of his time here upon the earth. Muhammad was born in the year 570 Christ. He died in the year 632. So as you can see, he lived for that day and age a relatively long life, something like 62 years. Muhammad, as I have alluded to earlier, basically grew up as an orphan. First cared very briefly for by his grandfather and later by an uncle. He grew up within an extended family, a clan within a tribe. But as far as mother and father at home, that was not really a part of his experience. We know very little about his early years historically. We do know that in 595, at the age of 25, Muhammad married. He married a woman by the name of Khadijah. Khadijah was 15 years older than Muhammad. Thus, a 25-year-old man marrying a 40-year-old woman. Khadijah was a very successful businesswoman. She was in the business of transporting goods by caravan, a camel caravan from Yemen to Damascus. Muhammad had worked for her and undoubtedly had been on some of those camel caravan journeys, both to the south to Yemen and to the north to Damascus. He was viewed as one who was quite ambitious, very capable, and thoroughly trustworthy. And so, evidently, seeing the integrity of this individual's life, and Khadijah being a widow, wanting a husband, and needing someone who could help her in more immediate and direct ways in her business, married Muhammad. Around the year 610, Muhammad began to have experiences that he concluded were revelations from God. Muhammad's habit, as the habit of a number of people in Arabia in those days, was to occasionally withdraw from life out to a cave and spend several days in quiet and meditation. It was on one of those occasions of withdrawal and meditation that Muhammad had this experience in which he believed that God spoke to him. Some Muslims would say it was God. Others would say it was God speaking through the archangel Gabriel. In any case, Muhammad believed that he had this divine encounter. During this encounter, the message that came to him was, recite. The word recite in Arabic is the word that gives us the English term Quran, Q-U-R-A-N, the name for the Islamic holy book, which we'll say more about in our next session. But the angel basically said to him, recite. And gradually Muhammad came to yield himself to this call to recite or to speak the message that was coming to him. When this first happened, he went home and told his wife. He thought he was going mad, or he feared that he was being possessed by a demon. Ironically, she reassured him and brought in her cousin, a man by the name of Waraka, who was nominally a Christian. And Waraka, the Christian cousin, likewise reassured Muhammad and said to him, "This is God. This is a message from God." These kinds of experiences came to Muhammad repeatedly over the next 2 or 3 years. He shared them only with a few friends very privately. His wife and 1 or 2 close friends became the first people to embrace the message that he was bringing, namely the message called Islam. And they came to accept that Muhammad was, in fact, a messenger from God. Around the year 613, in other words, 3 years after he began to have these experiences, Muhammad began in a public way to preach what he was hearing. Now, as you can well imagine, in Mecca, a commercial capital, a place where people were interested simply in advancing themselves for the most part, his message sounded rather strange. He was sort of a weird street corner preacher, if you will, who was fairly easily dismissed for a while. But the longer he went on, the more pointed his messages became, and the more threatened the invested population of Mecca came to feel. In Muhammad's early preaching, he was emphasizing the idea of the oneness of God. There is just one God. And remember, this is in the midst of a polytheistic community. He was preaching the reality of the day of judgment. A number of the people of the city of Mecca basically believed that when you're dead, you're dead. And the idea of living your life in such a way as to have to give an answer for it in the day of judgment was a new and threatening and unacceptable idea. Muhammad preached sermons that centered on the duty of this one God, Allah. Muhammad had a great deal to say about the need for those who had possessions to be generous toward those who had none. And so he was speaking of his concern for powerless people, having been one of that powerless group earlier. Also early on, Muhammad began to wrestle with how to validate in the eyes of the people his claim to be a messenger of God. Well, you can well imagine that as these things unfolded, more and more opposition developed to Muhammad. As he began to gather around him a group of followers, usually young men and often single men, people who were somewhat his own age, in their 20s and 30s, maybe early 40s, the sons of some of the elite families of the community. You can well understand how fathers and grandfathers would have reacted. Plus, if people began to take his message seriously, then the potential was there for the economic establishment of the community to be threatened. If suddenly people were going to have to think in terms of justice and generosity and gratitude, then the old way of simply living for yourself and making money was going to go by the way. And in turn, the wealthy were going to suffer significant loss. Along the way, a member of Muhammad's extended family who had been his protector died. This was a significant event in his life. As long as this individual was alive, he was able to extend a curtain of protection over Muhammad. In effect, this individual was sort of saying, you harm Muhammad and you will have to answer to me. And Arabs understood this business of blood vengeance. And so they kept hands off. But then the protector died. The question then came up, well, who will step forward now to extend protection? And no one was willing. Consequently, Muhammad found himself more and more in a precarious position. At one time, he sent some of his followers to Ethiopia to get them out of Mecca. Later, they came back. But then as the intensity of the opposition to Muhammad increased, it became apparent that Muhammad was going to have to leave. This took place in the year 622. This event is called the Hijra, H-I-J-R-A-H, Hijra, which basically means immigration. This is the label given to the event in Muhammad's life when he left Mecca, which had been the center of his life and work up until now, and moved 250 miles toward the northwest to the city that we know today as Medina. To escape Mecca, Muhammad devised a plan. His plan involved his followers slipping out in small numbers over the course of a number of days. And finally, last of all, Muhammad and 2 or 3 close friends left in the middle of the night. Someone heard that they had gone, and a group from Mecca set out to pursue them, intending to do them in. The tradition is that Muhammad found a cave and hid in the cave. And a spider sent by God wove a large web over the entrance of the cave. And so when Muhammad's pursuers came, they came to the cave. It was closed by a spider web, and they said, well, obviously, he hasn't gone in there. As big as that web is, it's been there a long while. And so they went on by. This is an Islamic tradition concerning an event in the life of Muhammad. After this, Muhammad made his way to the city of Medina. He was welcomed in Medina. In fact, he had been invited to come to Medina. The people of Medina were experiencing internal problems within the city. There were different clans, different ethnic groups, different political agendas, and there was no cohesiveness in the community. The people of Medina had been to Mecca on pilgrimage and had heard Muhammad preach and had learned something about his reputation. And thus, they thought, here is a trustworthy individual, one who is seeking to call for justice and right order. Let's invite him to come and to, in effect, become the arbitrator among the contending parties within our city. So, this is the reason that Muhammad chose Medina and not some other place to go to. How do you go about forging a community that will work out of diverse elements with a history of selfishness and conflict with one another? Quite an undertaking. How would you, who are students in this class, how would you bring together people of other faiths, other races, other economic experiences who have been at odds with one another? This was Muhammad's task when he got to Medina. One of the things that he did early on was to enter into an agreement with the population in Medina. It is sometimes called the Covenant of Medina. In the process of working out this covenant, Muhammad set forth the ground rules, according to which people would interact with one another, and in turn the authority to him as he sought to bring them to some sort of state of reconciliation and harmony. Thus it is that Muhammad had to deal with a variety of problems, some internal, some external. In terms of the internal problems, he had to find the way to establish something like a unified community. He worked at that through the covenant that we have just alluded to. He also had the need of meeting immediate physical needs. After all, he had brought a considerable number of followers with him from Mecca. When they came to Medina, there were no businesses for them to open. There was no available ground for them to occupy, to plant crops, and to serve as farmers. What do? Well, Muhammad hit upon the idea of raiding the caravans, particularly the caravans that belonged to the Meccan merchants who were his enemies. This would further weaken them, undermine their position, and it would also give him some of the needed resources for his associates or companions who had made the journey with him from Mecca to Medina. Then he had the task of simply deepening the knowledge of Islam. After all, there were people within Medina who embraced Islam even before Muhammad came. But what did they really know about this religion? And so how to go about helping them to better understand what it meant to be a Muslim. Muhammad also had the task of dealing with two groups. Those who were labeled the hypocrites, and then the second group, the Jews. Within the community of Medina, there were some who became Muslims but really didn't take it seriously. They were nominal. It was convenient. Muhammad was determined that his followers would avoid any kind of hypocrisy or shallowness, that they would be thoroughgoing and devout in their practice of Islam. Hence a challenge to be dealt with. The Jews presented another problem. He had anticipated that they might welcome him as one standing in the tradition of the prophets of the Old Testament. But they were adamant in their refusal to embrace any sort of prophethood associated with Muhammad. Muhammad shortly decided that they were a threat, and through various actions, banishment and other actions, he eventually dealt with 3 different Jewish clans, leaving the city of Medina free from any Jewish presence. Externally, Muhammad had to deal with overcoming the Meccans. The people of Mecca, the leadership of Mecca, having seen Muhammad escape, were determined that he would not grow in power and influence. Muhammad aggravated them by raiding their caravans. And so on several occasions they set forth armies to engage Muhammad and his followers, hoping to defeat and to overthrow them. In 624 there was a major battle at a place called Badr, B-A-D-R. This battle became to the Muslims a sign that they were indeed the people of God on the right track. A Muslim group of only a few hundred engaged a Meccan group of more than 1,000. The Muslim group won with hardly a casualty. The Meccan army was scattered and lost dozens of people dead. How can 200 or less defeat 1,000 or more? The only answer that the Muslims could come up with is the hand of God was with them. This was a major confirmation to Muhammad of his role as prophet and propelled him forward with even greater strength and vigor. Eventually, in the year 632, Muhammad was allowed to return to Mecca, and in fact was welcomed into the city, the Meccan leadership having determined better to allow him in peaceably than to continue to fight him when it's evident that sooner or later they were going to lose at great cost to themselves. So in 630, Muhammad returned triumphantly to Mecca. He cleansed the central sanctuary called the Kaaba of the idols that were there. Remember, this part of the world was polytheistic. And he established Islam as the religion of Mecca. In the next 2 years of his life, the last 2 years, Muhammad was primarily concerned with the growth and the expansion of Islam through the Arabian Peninsula. By the time of his death, which was rather sudden, in the year 632, all of Arabia, or almost all of Arabia, had come under Islamic influence. You can go to a link to the life of Muhammad, which will sketch out for you the basic dates that I have shared with you as we have gone through this material. There is another link that you can go to. It is entitled The Muhammad of Faith. When you look at it, you will see a number of terms enumerated that have come to be descriptive of Muhammad as Islam has continued to develop. You see, we not only have the Muhammad of history, some of which I have related to you, but we have the Muhammad of faith. And as time has moved on, Muhammad has become for the Muslim more than just a prophet. Muhammad is described as the seal of the prophets. That simply means he is the last prophet who ends all other prophets. As we might think of a door being closed and some sort of a seal placed on it, so that if it's ever opened again, the seal has to be broken. Well, Muhammad is that seal saying that the door that would open for more prophets never open again. Muhammad is seen as the pattern of life for the Muslim. How should a Muslim live his life or her life? The answer is follow the example of Muhammad. Well, where do you find that? We'll talk about that in another session also, in the traditions. Muhammad never claimed to be sinless. In fact, in the Quran, he acknowledges shortcomings. And yet, in Islamic thought today, Muhammad is viewed as sinless, never having committed any significant or serious wrong in the course of his life. In the Quran, Muhammad is described as one who was not a miracle worker. And yet today, the Muhammad of faith is assumed to have been one who performed multitudes of different miracles. What I'm saying is that over the course of time, this Muhammad of history, whose life we have reviewed, has become embroidered in such a way with qualities and characteristics that are almost turning him into a semi-divine being. In some Islamic literature, Muhammad is referred to as the light. And Muslims talk about the light of Muhammad appearing in certain places. This is almost an incarnational idea as Muslims talk about it. More and more, Muhammad becomes the object of Islamic devotion. More and more, he is given titles that to Christians almost sound like the titles given to Christ. Intercessor, mediator, most exalted, terms of these kinds. Muslims today believe they can find all sorts of references to Muhammad in the Bible. And the passages they typically point to in the Old Testament are passages that you and I would read as messianic, of the coming of Jesus Christ. Muhammad in the New Testament is associated with the Comforter in the Gospel of John. So you see then that there is this process of deification that is going on in a rather continuous manner as Muslims more and more come to exalt Muhammad. Now we might ask, how is this the case? Why is this the case? My simple answer is this. Imagine here you are as a Christian. God is incarnate from your perspective. God lives in Jesus Christ. Jesus is a miracle worker. Jesus is sinless. Jesus is the mediator and the intercessor. Here is the Muslim with Muhammad, a man who did no miracles, who made mistakes. Well, to say the least, the playing field is unlevel. Through the centuries then, Islam has compensated by elevating Muhammad, even as in its interpretation of Jesus, those things that we associate with the deity of Jesus have been taken away. So that Jesus, though a miracle worker and sinless, is nonetheless just a human being. I want you to hit your pause button and then go to a link. The first link that I want you to go to is called Magna, M-A-G-N-A. At this link, you will find a Muslim perspective on who Muhammad is and his significance to humankind. I want you to look at that. I want you to read it. And then I want you to go to a second link, and it is called Debate. This is a Christian link, and it will provide you with a Christian viewpoint concerning the place, the role of Muhammad. And when you have done that, then you have an assignment to post to me at the bulletin board. I want to know your reaction to each of these two perspectives. What you think, what you feel, what unsettled you, what left you with a great deal of confidence. This assignment carries significant points to it in terms of determining your grade. Now as we come back, there are a few additional things that we need to say about Muhammad. When it comes to thinking about the life of Muhammad, we have to ask, what are the sources on which a life of Muhammad can be based? The answer is that they are very few indeed. In terms of sources, written sources that go back close to the time of Muhammad, the nearest one that we have is by a person whose name is Ibn Ishaq, that is the son of Isaac, who died in 767. This individual pulled together stories about the life of Muhammad and wrote the first life of Muhammad that we know of. Well, if you remember, Muhammad died in 632. This man died in 767. So there is a gap of 135 years between the death of Muhammad and the death of Ibn Ishaq. This is not to say that his information is not reliable, but it is to say that he evidently was dependent upon a number of oral traditions or maybe other written materials, none of which have come down to us today. If you are interested in looking more closely at some of the principal sources of the life of Muhammad, there is a link that at your leisure you can go to, simply called Principal Sources of the Life of Muhammad. Muhammad's life presents us with some challenges. As we think about Muhammad, we have to wrestle with what become apparent shortcomings in his life. Muhammad, in dealing with his opposition, sometimes appears to have been deceptive. Muhammad, in dealing with certain people, led to the conclusion that they should be executed. This was true of one of the Jewish clans in Medina. Now, Muslim scholars would say that Muhammad was simply doing what he had to do in order to establish his reign. And they also would remind us of some of the stories in the Old Testament where the people of God killed multitudes of those who were their enemies. We also sometimes find people being troubled with Muhammad's patterns of marriage. Muhammad seems to have on regular occasions granted himself exceptions in terms of the number of wives he would have over and above the number imposed upon his followers. Some have been very appalled at the story of Muhammad taking Miriam, the Coptic girl, as his wife when she was only 8 years old. What do we do with Muhammad? How do we think about it? This becomes an important question as we wrestle with the issue of witness to the Muslim. Sooner or later, as we converse with Muslims, a Muslim is going to say to us, "What do you think about Muhammad?" To respond in a strong negative way, to in effect say Muhammad was a deceitful individual, he was a liar, he was an individual who was lecherous in a number of different ways, he was one who in no sense could have been thought of as a prophet of God. To simply land Muhammad is in effect to close the conversation with our Muslim friend. So we have to be careful how we answer. We have to appreciate the things that Muhammad did that in many ways were exceptional, without ever embracing the idea of his prophethood. We have to answer as briefly and as tactfully as we can, step around the issue, and then go on. Because ultimately, as we interact with Muslims, the issue is not Muhammad. The issue is Jesus. And to get sidetracked and train wrecked in a response to what do you think of Muhammad is not going to do us any good in our efforts to relate to the Muslim. So, as we draw this session to a close, I have one last assignment for you. Having heard what you've heard, having looked at the links that you've looked regarding Muhammad in teaching a course like an Introduction to Islam. And why would you pick those things? I need to hear from you as you post that back to me on the bulletin board. Good hunting, good thinking. We'll get together again shortly.